to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside our private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This Honourable House now resume its sittings. Call of the roll.
Mr. Whittle, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Wheatley, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brownberg, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Mr. Brown, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Wright.
Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, we are going to have a statement by the Minister of National Security, giving an update on the situation as it is today.
Speaker, seek your permission to speak from a seat other than my own. Yeah, all right. Yes,
Dr.
I
Chan.
gave 2 copies there. I can get you another one. Thank you. Circulate somewhere. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to update the Honourable House on a number of issues pertaining to the national security portfolio, more specifically the situation in western Jamaica, and in particular the parish of Westmoreland, which made the national headlines on the last week. On May 1, 2018, saw a total of 7 persons being killed in Grange Hill, Westmoreland. Among the victims were 2 of our children, who our future, a potential teacher or politician any time. 2-year-old Sheldon Morgan, 10-year-old Nicole Bourne, and several other Jamaicans have fallen victim to consequences of illicit labeled lotto scamming activities, which is the primary source of funding for organized criminal activities carried out by the violence producers in this region. In fact, the intelligence tells us that the feud between the Kings Valley Gang and the Sterling Godfrey Gang is directly responsible for the events of May 1st, that in addition to the murders and shooting, saw destruction of property and overall disruption of public order and community safety in that quiet rural town. On Wednesday the 2nd, May 2, 2018, following the incident, I was accompanied by the Commissioner of Police and the Member of Parliament for the area, Dr. Wickham McNeil, to the scene where we engaged several residents. At the same time, additional personnel from the security forces were deployed on the ground in Westmoreland. This was one of the several responses we execute an all-out effort to nab the perpetrators and bring them to justice. Between May 2 and May 4, Joint Security Forces operations have focused on the Savannah, Little London, and Grange Hill area. These efforts yielded the detention of 93 persons, including 11 persons of interest, the recovery of 1 AK-47, 1 magazine containing 7.62 rounds. Additionally, 2 persons of interest in the May 1st incident in Grange Hill have since turned themselves into the police. Additionally, we have successfully arrested 13, that is, apprehended and charged 13 wanted gang members and 1 facilitator who also has his business closed, violence facilitator. It should be noted that during this period, at the same time, on the morning of Thursday, May 3, while joint security deployment was taking place, the Jamaica Defence Force was dealing with a downed aircraft in Trelawney and also conducted a narcotics interdiction at sea, where some 11 bags amounting to 784 pounds of compressed ganja was identified, and some of that was actually thrown overboard before they were interdicted. On the 4th of May, the joint JDF-JCF operations extended itself to Negril and neighboring divisions where goods were seized, additional persons of interest were arrested. On the following day, Saturday, May 5, an additional person of interest turned himself in, and as of May 18, an additional Uzi submachine gun was discovered and 6 persons arrested. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that the Joint Security Forces relying on intelligence on the ground and making operational changes have garnered significant success in Westmoreland. The Honourable House should also note that as a means of sustaining progress, the JDF has re-established a forward operating base within Westmoreland at the Barnum Wharf. It's not written there. And has commenced joint patrols primarily in the hotspot areas in the division. This is being supported by domestic patrols on the Westmoreland Police Division. Mr. Speaker, while we work within the principles of clear, hold, and build, it is important to note that in order to reach the build phase, there must be a deliberate effort on the part of security forces to rid these vulnerable communities of the violence producers. Our policy position of dealing with gang leaders is to see them arrested, charged, and incarcerated for the crimes against people and the state. We envision that in the media, it will be good to see images of dons and gang leaders being escorted to court by police officers as a testimony of our new way of doing business. I say this because there might have been some misunderstanding, and I pause here, of my comments in Westmoreland. I'm not going to apologize for those comments in this context they're in. But the policy and the philosophy governing apprehension of gangsters is very simple. We need to diminish the heroic image of the gang leader. That is what attracts young, vulnerable individuals who want to be dons. Therefore, it is important to apprehend them, investigate, take them to court, convict them, and incarcerate them. If we can do that successfully, it is the best mechanism of destroying the image of this donmanship, who becomes the hero of humble individuals in the community. That is the policy framework which we're operating in. But, Mr. Speaker, those who of us who are in Westmoreland, if you have an image of what happened, you understand when we describe the behavior as animalistic and what happened there. Because the video taping, which was cameras owned by the victim, so the individuals who are involved are not exactly deprived individuals. They have reasonably comfortable home, and they were able to put up security cameras around the property, and they drive motor cars. And the image of another Jamaican, not only shooting a mother and an 11-year-old, but they shoot the father, and they did not shoot the son by accident because of his arm. They turned the father over and shot the 2-year-old child. That's the image I was dealing with in the situation. And it is, I bring it here today so that we as a people can understand the need for going forward as a country committed to rid ourselves of criminal corruption as a united team and doing what's necessary to get us overcome this problem. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that what we need to move with deliberate efforts to further curtail organized criminal gang activity, utilizing the legislative framework required. We have to make amendments. They'll come to this House in the Anti-Gang Law, Procedure of Crime Act, Anti-Lottery Scamming Act at our disposal. This Honourable House should note that the Ministry of National Security is currently reviewing these laws to enhance their capability, and rest assured we will be going after these criminals, taking the proceeds out of crime, seizing their assets, and those assets which they have also placed in names of members of their families, which is a way of hiding their ill-gotten gains. In Westmoreland, there are 3 major gang feuds currently in place, which account for most of the murders and shootings. In fact, the police estimate over 90%. There's an ongoing feud between the Dexter Street Gang and the Darling Street Gang. And for those who don't know what we're talking, it's the right-hand side and left-hand side of Great George Street, which is the main street down Salomar. They're not far from each other. You walk across the road. And there's the Kings Valley Gang versus the Sterling Godfrey Gang, which resulted in the particular feud last on May 1st. That particular grouping is just one side of Grangehill, which may be called the north side against the other side of Grangehill, which is being led by a number of individuals who have gained enormous resources from illicit electronic fraud, otherwise called lottery scamming. The individuals are identifiable, and we have to find legal process of trying to reduce their overwhelming capacity in this community. There's 2 groups in Negril with different names, named after different individuals. Sometimes they vary. One is called the God Elvin Gang, and the other names for that grouping, and versus the Russell faction. We're not as successful in apprehending most of the Negril individuals, although one of them have turned themselves in. But as a result of these feuds, Westmoreland continued to experience an upsurge in violence, with a total of some 57 murders and 64 shooting incidents reported during the period of January 1 to May 5. This represents an increase of some 30%, except over the 2017 comparative period. Intelligence suggests that some 36 incidents of murder and 18 shootings have been linked directly to the gang conflict. The areas of Savamar, Negril, and Grangeville have been classified as hotspots, with several communities within these vicinities affected due to fallouts related to drugs for guns trade and lotto scamming syndicates. The drugs for guns trade is very active on the south coast, and you'll note that I mentioned in the presentation that on the very week that the security forces were down there, we intercepted a boat with a very substantial shipment of compressed ganja, which was heading out to sea, quite likely Haiti, as one of the individuals on board is a Haitian national. These include communities of Church Lincoln in the Grangeville area, Top Lincoln, Kings Valley, Mint Road, Puna Hill, Sterling or Godfrey Street, and Fullersfield District, where 3 houses were burnt down in the conflict. It has been posited that numbers within the JCF are too small to respond effectively to the needs of the state of emergency. At the current strength, a little under 12,000, the ratio is 242 per 100,000. In normal situation, not extremely low, but not necessarily the best numbers. But I must point out that the former minister, my predecessor, the member from St. Mary, took significant steps to increase the level of training for police. On Friday of this week, some 300 new recruits will graduate and join the ranks of the JCF. He has established memorandum of understanding with several tertiary institutions to ensure that we can recruit another quality level of individual and encourage members to join the police force so that we can, in fact, compensate for the number of men leaving the force. But, Mr. Speaker, while we recognize the need for additional officers and the replacement of those who are resigned and retired, it is also important to address other fundamental issues that are affecting the Jamaica Constabulary Force. The ministry has been embarking on radical approaches to reform the JCF by modernizing capabilities through the use of increased technology and improved electronics, and to enable the force in its delivery of 21st century type policing services. These efforts are being implemented parallel to work being carried out by the Commissioner and the senior officers to carry out organizational reform within the Jamaica Constabulary Force. It may be said, as I've said elsewhere, you cannot pour new wine in old wineskin, as the good book will tell us. My colleague and my good friend from, as opposition spokesman on national security, is a bit concerned about the crime plan. I'll say I understand. We will have to put some more body on the 5 principles outlined by the former minister, which is a strategy. But timing is appropriate, not in the sense of when we speak to a crime plan, because there have been many plans before. What I want to assure the members are, when we speak both in confidence and in this House, what we bring here will be programs that can be executed within the budgetary framework we have and that timeline. So, all in own time, my friend. Mr. Speaker, the oldest and simplest justification for the government is as a protector and protect the citizens from violence. A safe and secure environment is one in which the population has the freedom to pursue daily activities without fear of persistent violence. Such an environment is characterized by an end to large-scale violence, adequate level of public order, the protection of communities, and the freedom of for people to move about without fear of undue harm. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, we will increase internal security operations within the division, targeting wanted persons, persons of interest, and known facilitators of the current gang rivalry that exists in the hotspot areas of Westmoreland. Increase human and physical resources, especially in the Morgan's Bridge Police District. That area includes, I think, Grange Hill, Little London, all the way to Sheffield. Inform personnel across the controlled ports of possible persons of interest from the division that may attempt to flee the island. Work with the Financial Investigation Division of the Ministry of Finance and the RPD to go after these criminals their cronies, and support systems in order to disable their resources and make them financially non-viable, and embark on the development of master plan for these communities to improve upon public order while at the same time enhancing access to social amenities. Again, I pause. The first thing the principal of Grange Hill Primary School said to me is, Minister, Grange Hill is still on the shift system. Help me get it off. The first comment of the principal of the Grange Hill Primary School. I have had discussion with the Minister of Education. Public order, Mr. Speaker, as we envision it, is a condition in which laws are enforced equitably, the lives, property, freedoms, and rights of individuals are protected, criminal-motivated violence has been reduced to a minimum, and criminal elements are pursued, arrested, and detained. Major illegal armed groups have been identified, disarmed, and demobilized, and national security forces operate lawfully and successfully. Mr. Speaker, the philosophy guiding operations is essentially apprehending gang leaders, locking them up, diminishing their stature as heroes within our communities, and bringing them to justice. It is not just boots on the ground. We are working with deliberate efforts to introduce organizational changes within the JCF to make it more accountable and responsive to city security, public safety, and the maintenance of peace. Western, Mr. Speaker, is a good place to begin. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for permission to speak from a seat other than my own.
Mr. Jackson, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I join the Minister in conveying my...
Mr. Jackson, before you proceed, I have been requested for the Member of Parliament from Westmoreland to make a comment. I am going to ask you to do your 5 minutes, and I'm the leader of government business will decide whether or not. I'm very sympathetic to the point, primarily because I saw you out there with the minister. I'm saying this because we're not setting a precedence. So when you finish, Mr. Jackson, Mr. McNeil, Dr. McNeil, will be permitted to, for 3 minutes, Mr. Jackson, you may do your 5 minutes.
Just a minute, Mr. Jackson, just a minute. Mr. Speaker, do we have a standing order in this House? If there's a standing order, it doesn't mean that you can make rules as you go along. There are issues where you have discretion, but not in this case. So in a case like this, you allow the member to finish, and after which, but you don't interject in that way. There's a standing order, and we have to follow the standing order.
The standing order also gives the Speaker some discretion. Mr. Jackson, you may proceed.
Yeah, Mr.
And follow the standing order.
Mr. Speaker.
5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I note your intervention, and I had intended to intimate that I will be very brief to allow my colleague, Member of Parliament from the affected constituency, to utilize even some of my time to make some comment as the directly affected MP. But I say I'll be very brief, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to enjoin the Minister in extending condolences to the family of those 7 Jamaicans who lost their lives in that circumstance, and to extend my sympathies to the families of the other 11 persons, 18 altogether, who were shot, 7 fatal. I had the opportunity, I took the time to visit the family on the weekend myself, and just the tone, the texture of the atmosphere down there, Mr. Speaker, was most distressing, even days after the event has occurred. And it conveys in a very profound way the human impact of these kind of savagery. And it underscores the urgency for us as a country to arrest situations like those. Interestingly, to Mr. Speaker, is that, well, first of all, in addition, I want to really commend the response of the security forces. I had the opportunity to meet with the commanding officer during my visit there also. And I learned, Minister, that before one of the constraining factor for the police post there is the question of motor vehicle. And it again indicates the urgency of providing the tools that we expect our limited police staff to work with in serving the people in the various communities. The second point I also wish to underscore, Mr. Speaker, is that the police responded the way they did. And as the Minister indicated, 93 persons were detained. Subsequently, 11 were charged, and some further number of persons were detained over that and charged during the period of time. In Westmoreland, where there is no state of emergency, in Westmoreland, where there is no zones of special operation. And that underscores the fact, Mr. Speaker, that the capacity or the being able to respond to criminal elements outside of a state of emergency, outside of our zones of special operation, is not outside our ability. And I make that point particularly, Mr. Speaker, because we don't want to see something like this happening in other areas of Jamaica. Westmoreland has been on the radar for a long time for the high murder rates. Westmoreland is in one of the areas where we know the gang activities have been quite active for a long period of time. So it is in a few other areas. And so one of the things we can do, Mr. Speaker, is to learn from this experience and apply that learning experience to other areas so we can be more preventative rather than reactive to those situations. Minister, you indicated about the steps being taken, such as the legislative framework. It would be useful, not just for the House, but for the country, to indicate some timelines that we are working with to put these in place. The police have for some time indicated that they need legislative support to do their work. It's incumbent on us in this House to do our part to support them in dealing with those. The anti-gang legislation, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the FLA Act, all of those legislative reform are upgrading steps. Those are in our remit, and we must deal with them with a great sense of urgency. Minister, I want to convey you have our full support in attending to these matters, and the earlier you can bring them to our attention, we'll be more than ready to act and cooperate with you to bring the matter under control.
Thank you, Mr. Groves.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Dr. McNeil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise just to...
Go ahead.
And I will be very brief. But I think there are just a few things I should say based on the fact that my constituency of Western Westmoreland has been so involved. It is, Mr. Speaker, ironic that last week when I wrote to support the extension of the state of emergency, that at that point in time we were having this problem in Grange Hill. And I indicated at that time that I did have a problem because, as I said, the amount of resources that are being used in Montego Bay meant that I had less resources in Westmoreland. And yet the criminals would be moving across the border. And it was only a matter of time that I thought that this powder keg may blow. Those fears came through. But what has happened subsequently is that the security forces have come in. There have been energetic operations in Westmoreland, and we have gotten additional forces. Both the soldiers are there, the army is there, as well as some from mobile. And there is increased investigative persons, and it has made a difference. I enjoy even the figures that you gave today. Just in the last week, since Tuesday, my information is for Westmoreland that we have only had one murder and one shooting outside of that in the week. And that murder was an inter-family problem that happened in Frome between family members. But as such, the crime situation has abated and things have become very quiet. We have had 93 persons arrested, 13 arrested and 93 detained. And as the spokesperson said, all of this was done without a state of emergency, and we're comfortable with where it's going. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I was not in the House to hear my colleague speak, but we had a meeting in Grange Hill at which we had all the justices of the peace, the pastors of the churches, the teachers, guidance counselors. We had the head of the security forces down there. We had the principals of the schools. And it was a very, very good meeting. First thing about the meeting, Mr. Speaker, is that it was bipartisan. We had councillors both from the People's National Party and councillors from the Labour Party who all spoke, as well as the caretaker for the area of Grange Hill from the other side. And what we're looking at, we recognize that there's a role that the community of Grange Hill has to play, because there are real issues, issues of parenting, issues of the schools, issues in the churches, and we have all agreed that we are going to come together in a bipartisan manner to work together to put some of these social issues to work on them. We're going to look at community youth groups, we're going to look at sports programs, we want to talk about the training centers, but we're going to do it together and work on it. The one thing, though, that we came out very strongly is that what has made a big difference is the presence of the security forces. And the one thing that I'm going to insist on, and I was asked by my constituents to reiterate it, is that we must maintain the presence of the security forces in Westmoreland across the length and breadth. If we sit down on top of this issue now, we may be able to resolve it. If we ever just treat it as a one-day occurrence and go away, what is going to happen, it will only be a matter of time that you will get a resurgence and it will be harder to resolve the second time around. So I would say through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, as was said by the spokesperson, you have the full support of me as a Member of Parliament, the full support bipartisan within Westmoreland for us to fight this scourge of crime. And I look forward to working with you, not just on how you're going to work with the security aspect of it, but how we will now proceed to resolve some of the social problems that are at the root of the problem. Thank you,
Dr. Manley. Mr. Golden.
Mr. Speaker, I have a question arising from this statement. If I may ask a question to the,
Let's go ahead.
The Minister. Thank you. Minister, your statement reiterates that criminal gangs are at the core of the incident that took place on the 1st of May. And it is, I think, generally recognized that most of the murders that are committed in this country are either by or influenced by criminal organizations. The criminal justice Suppression of Criminal Organizations Act 2014, the so-called anti-gang legislation, was passed and was brought into operation in April 2014. Section 21 of that act specifically mandates that a joint select committee should be appointed to review the act and how it's working within 3 years of that coming into force. That 3-year period expired a year ago in April 2017. We haven't had that joint select committee review. And I've seen comments in the media from the Director of Public Prosecutions saying, for example, that the Act doesn't have powers of seizure and search, and she would like to see that in it. There are powers of seizure and search in other statutes which the police can use, but she would like to see it in that Act. The police were very involved in the development of that Act, Minister. The Commissioner of Police, the then Commissioner of Police, Ellington, was in legislation committee when we went through that bill with a fine-tooth comb and played an active role in that, not only in promoting it, but in getting into the granular details when we were going through it at legislation committee. The DPP's office was also present at that stage, but it was, in a sense, pioneering legislation because it was largely homegrown. There were some aspects of it which were borrowed from elsewhere, but a lot of it was designed locally, and we realized that it would have to be reviewed to see how it played out in practice on the ground. I'm going to urge you, Minister, let us have that joint select committee review. I'm sure you're doing your own review internally, but the benefit of a joint select committee review is that you would have the input of both sides of the House and the wider society, who are stakeholders who may want to come. It doesn't have to be a very long review. It's not a very long act. But it would be a useful, and it's a mandatory exercise. We're in breach of the law currently, but by virtue of not having done it within the time frame allotted. So I would urge you, sir, if you would initiate that quickly so we could have that review done and benefit from it, given how central the gang problem is in the national security landscape of our country.
Thank you. First, let me thank my colleagues for the expression of support. I think the events, in fairness, this House has been working in concert on the issue of crime for a number of weeks. And I think the Westmoreland situation literally has concretized that position, because everyone realizes this. The level of criminal gangs operation in Jamaica is beyond any normal level and requires the total nation to be committed to all men of goodwill, men and women, to deal with this major problem. In answer to my friend's question, I'll give you an undertaking to ensure that the select committee is activated. I'd say not longer than 2 weeks from now, in that some internal work will be done by the legal departments, but we can get this done quickly. We'll consult and have this joint select committee set up, because it's a matter that needs to be dealt with urgently and quickly as part of the total fight against criminal activity. Operations are continuing in Westmoreland, I agree, and that's why I mentioned the other activities happening. We have indicated before that the state of emergency is not a permanent solution to fighting crime. Other things have to be there, and operational activity was taking place in Westmoreland. In fact, the member will be aware that it was about 2 weeks before that the commanding officer was changed in Westmoreland, and some other operational activity was being put in place. So the fight for Crime Island must continue. And I do think if we get the appropriate operation in place, the SOEs and DOSOs are retained as legislation that can be executed where there is, we consider as a country it is required. So we recognize that, and it has to be used as the weapon of last resort. But we have faced some very challenging times. It's good that the security force was able to go into Westmoreland and react in the way they did. But intimate not only we had made some changes in personnel in Westmoreland just before, some of what is emerging in Westmoreland is that, let me put on the half glass of this full, there's a certain level of confidence in individuals who are now in the parish. And there are many more people who are willing to speak to certain leadership. And that, I think, I'll leave that for now, and we will ensure that that confidence that has been renewed is retained and that the people will remain there so we can retain a level of control over what's happening in Westmoreland. There are other areas we'll have to go into, I agree, and I mentioned in time of that operational activity does help. The question of the social engagement intervention is crucial wherever we in areas of high volatility, although they vary from place to place. The problems in section of Western Jamaica is not so much economic deprivation in any way as in some of the urban areas that I have seen and we are aware of. There are different aspects which we won't go into a debate on, but operational changes were made in the section of South St. Andrew, and we have seen some stabilization. Not perfect, but there's certainly been far less violence in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I think it is, that we have made some operational changes down there. Well, not we, the Commissioner of Police have done. And we need some more. I agree, right? But I just mentioned the point that we are agreeing if we can make operational changes that can have an impact on the crime situation, but there's sometimes deeper problems we'll discuss in another place that affects the confidence of the individuals. But I thought I'd bring this further. Westmoreland, I said, was a very low point in the history and a very tragic event, which not only requires the sympathy but action by the government, executive action to help to stem the tide of crime in the island. We continue that fight and we continue together. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Do I repeat? Bills brought from the Senate, petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motion given orally.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Gun Court Amendment Act 2018.
Mr. Twaits.
Mr. Speaker, at the next meeting of the House, I beg to introduce a motion reading as follows. Whereas the education system in Jamaica does not adequately inculcate the values needed for productive citizenship, be it resolved that this Honourable House debate the changes needed to achieve higher standards of values-based education and behaviour.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Presentation of bills without the leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Minister Samuda.
Mr. Speaker, there has been a slight change in the order due to some logistical changes. First, we will have the Member of Parliament from Southeast St. Anne. Then we will have the Minister of Finance presenting the debate will continue on the Act to amend the Public Procurement Act, and I believe we will hear from the opposition spokesman who will reply, and the Minister will close the debate today. Then we will have the Act to facilitate the implementation of the child diversion in the criminal justice system and for connected matters. And then we will look forward to the closing of the debate by the member from Central Kingston, who will make his presentation in the sectoral debate. We feel that... No, it's not midnight. Somebody... If it is that he will speak until midnight, somebody would have had to speak until midnight. In this case, we feel it is best that the member from Central Kingston becomes the night watchman. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Lisa Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I find myself once again on my feet contributing to these debates. But this time, there are a number of firsts. It's the first time that I'm in a new portfolio, thanks to the Leader of the Opposition, whose faith and guidance are serving me well. It is also the first time that two women lead this portfolio in Jamaica, but it is my second in shadowing a portfolio with another. Mr. Speaker, having spent several years over covering youth and culture, I really want to place on record my appreciation to the member from Central St. Catherine, whose spontaneous approach to ambush gave me many memorable moments that I will treasure in this Parliament and beyond. Mr. Speaker, this is also the first time that I've been given the opportunity to thank Richard formally as my husband in this Parliament. And I want to thank him for his patience and his loving support over the past decade. Turn around. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't have been here were it not for the people of Southeast St. Anne and their continued support. Their spirit is what gives me strength every single day. My office staff and other persons who are here, Nicolette, Loy, Kerry, P, Suzanne, and the countless others who continue to provide support and hold my back. My hardworking Councillor Bell, Ian Trumpet Bell, Southeast and I owe you a debt of gratitude. The Most Honourable P.J. Patterson, Ambassador Ralph Thomas, Senator K.D. Knight, Dr. Kate Carlton Davis, members of my task force, I thank you for your wise advice and counsel. Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank some of my friends who are here today and single out as well a representative from the Cuban Embassy who never fails to give me support when I ask for it. Finally, Mr. Speaker, my eternal gratitude to my beloved political party, the PNP, whose courage, activism, and principled approach to engagement, whether locally or globally, makes me proud to call myself a comrade every single time. Mr. Speaker, Venezuela has a 49% ownership stake in our only oil refinery. So when I asked the Energy Minister recently whether the sanctions introduced by the United States of America on Venezuela would have a direct bearing on Petrojam's ability to trade cost-effectively, he seemed a little unconcerned. He passed off a follow-up question about whether Jamaica's position going forward included seeking regional support as one for the Foreign Affairs Minister. But we've heard nothing, Mr. Speaker, on the subject from the Foreign Affairs Minister, who seems content for the issue to be handled in the Energy Ministry. But, Mr. Speaker, as the Energy Minister intimated, this issue was then, is now, and continues to be one of foreign affairs and foreign trade. Why? Because Jamaica's oil comes from foreign. Our preferential trade agreements, Mr. Speaker, under the Petrocaribe Fund, graciously provided by the government of Venezuela, represents the largest loan with the best financial terms in our independent history. At a 1% interest rate, Venezuela provided Jamaica more than $3 billion US. The Venezuelan government went even further and accepted a $1.5 billion settlement of our debt in July 2015, which not only reduced our debt to GDP ratio significantly, but also helped to improve our international financial standing in aggregate terms. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's economic survival has been due in no small measure to the support and generosity of the Venezuelan people. From the insincere-sounding platitudes expressed during the visit of the then U.S. Secretary of State, which sounded more like fawning than independent policy, it has been painful to watch this administration's reluctance to take a lead in CARICOM toward a unified position on Venezuela. Mr. Speaker, we must never abandon our friends or be seen under any circumstance to do the bidding for others to enforce their dominion on a sovereign nation. I'm hoping that the nonchalant view expressed by the member from South Central St. Catherine doesn't epitomize this administration's overarching philosophy for foreign affairs. However, on the face of it, his defensive response, especially viewed through the prism of recent actions, or more appropriately, non-action, is conspicuously cautious and leaves certain questions unanswered. Mr. Speaker, why is it that the government has been reluctant to take a lead in CARICOM on a unified position on Venezuela? Mr. Speaker, why is it that the government abstained from the crucial vote at the United Nations General Assembly on a resolution regarding Jerusalem? And why, despite questions raised in this House by the opposition in 2017, there has been no explanation of the Prime Minister's official visit to Israel and his extension of an invitation to Israel's Prime Minister's visit to Jamaica? Why is it, Mr. Speaker, that there seems to be an inadequate engagement of the African, Caribbean, Pacific community under Jamaica's leadership towards the renegotiation of terms under the Cotonou Agreement, which expires in 2020, even though we actually sit in the chair of the ACP? Mr. Speaker, why is it that earlier this year the government didn't use the opportunity in the meeting with the then U.S. Secretary of State to extend the agenda beyond exclusive bilateral U.S.-Jamaica affairs to include regional and hemispheric affairs? Mr. Speaker, one of the things that that meeting would have afforded us is to ask about immigration proposed policy changes by the United States, which could stymie any deportation cooperation that we have with our overseas partner, and it will also impact on our diaspora. Mr. Speaker, why has there been no public response by the government of Jamaica, especially to the discontinuation of programs to build resilience to climate change, given last year's natural disaster events that affected this region? Mr. Speaker, rather than presenting a proactive, operationalized foreign affairs and foreign trade policy that is courageous, strategic, and principled, this government is relying on an approach that could easily be named the doctrine of doing nothing. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica, under the leadership of the People's National Party, developed an enviable reputation of courage and activism in the international arena. Our consistent approach to taking principled decisions have served us well, earning Jamaica the distinction of chairing the G77 countries and China twice and having a seat at the United Nations Security Council. For these and other reasons, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's input in matters relating to foreign diplomacy has been and remains highly sought after by our allies. The People's National Party has always shown assertive, courageous, and enlightened leadership in foreign policy and diplomacy. First, when the Right Excellent Norman Manley decided to lead the world against apartheid and said to the world, look, we're not going to trade with South Africa once this regime is in place. Since then, the policies of successive administrations under my political party certainly has been founded on, one, the respect for nation sovereignty, two, the respect for human rights and self-determinations for citizens of all countries, three, a non-aligned stance, and four, economic development for all. Mr. Speaker, I need not remind this House that Michael Manley's unrelenting support for forging alliances and diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1972, Brazil, China, and the League of African Leaders and P.J. Patterson's leadership of CARICOM and his engagement of Venezuela have reaped immeasurable benefits for Jamaica. Over the past 55 years, Mr. Speaker, we stood with the rest of the world, and we understood that Jamaica's influence was stronger working as a team within the world and within the international community. But these days, Jamaica is mostly silent and compliant. Even now, as CARICOM is meeting at a conference of the Council for Foreign and Commonwealth Relations, attended by the region's foreign affairs ministers in session in the Bahamas, Jamaica seems strangely silent amid strident calls for unity. The Bahamas Foreign Affairs Minister told the opening ceremony that CARICOM's inchoate objectives, which are to encourage economic integration and cooperation, to even-handedly share therefrom, and to coordinate foreign policy in the interests of the collective, were as urgent today as they were at Chaguaramas in 1973. My own take, Mr. Speaker, is that they're more urgent now than ever before. Mr. Speaker, if this government's doctrine of doing nothing continues, Jamaica will not only run the risk of destroying our enviable reputation of courage and activism in the international arena, but we will erode years of consistently approaching decision-making on principle, which has served Jamaica well and brought us desired results. Mr. Speaker, the most pressing issue that we have before us is whether the WTO rules which have facilitated stability will stand. Consistent with its doctrine of doing nothing, the government has indicated a wait-and-see monitoring approach. It wasn't long ago, perhaps in 2007, 2008, when facing a similar crisis in the global economy, the then finance minister announced that Jamaica wouldn't be affected. Government did nothing about the world economic crisis then, and look at what happened to us. Our economy went into a recession. Mr. Speaker, the United States has announced trade sanctions and tariffs. Britain has decided to withdraw from the European Union and to re-engage the Commonwealth. The Prime Minister has basically said nothing on these game changers in international trade. Mr. Speaker, anyone who doesn't take President Trump or his imminent danger of some of his policies and what they can do to Jamaica does so at their own peril. Mr. Speaker, we've lived in a world where global growth has been facilitated by free trade. However, these established rules can now be changed immediately by Twitter. A trade war, certainly a global trade war, is not in Jamaica's best interest. President Trump has signaled a potential global trade war in March of this year by placing tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, tariffs on certain goods imported from China or Chinese-owned companies, wherever they may be located, implementing sanctions on Russian-owned companies, and proposed sanctions on all countries that trade with Venezuela. All the major countries, Mr. Speaker, have signaled their intent to retaliate, indicating that disruptions to global trade could actually continue for some time. Jamaica is highly dependent, Mr. Speaker, on imports, and so we must ensure that our supply of foods, raw materials, and other necessities are not adversely affected by these dislocations. Mr. Speaker, right after President Trump imposed those sanctions, we brought these issues and the need for Jamaica to plan a proactive and strategic response to these possibilities to the government's action. The Foreign Affairs Minister responded with a very lengthy statement to Parliament that essentially failed to address these issues, but took what the opposition considers a very simplistic view as to where our bauxite was processed, and that Jamaica wasn't at this time producing steel nor aluminium. Mr. Speaker, not only is it the intention of our Chinese investors in St. Elizabeth to produce steel and aluminum in time, but we live in a connected world, and anything of this magnitude affecting the price of commodities such as steel and aluminum in China, in Russia, or in the United States of America affects not only us, but it affects all countries. Brazil, Mr. Speaker, has recently agreed to export quotas. rather than tariffs on steel. However, more than likely to offset their reduced market, they may raise their prices. Jamaica imports steel, Mr. Speaker, from Brazil, so Jamaica is affected. Steel and aluminum from China is used as a raw material in the United States for the manufacture of many products that we buy as Jamaicans: cars, appliances, and equipment. The United States is our largest trading partner, Mr. Speaker, so an increase in price for their raw materials will mean an increase in price of the finished goods we import from the United States of America, containing whether it's China's steel and aluminum, or Russia's steel, or Brazil's steel. Again, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica will be affected. In any event, wherever in the world we send our bauxite, that factory either sells the finished aluminum to the United States or would like to sell it to the United States in the future. Most recently, you see Rusal staved off any jeopardy to its mining potential by these sanctions. Because, Mr. Speaker, we need to wake up. The world is connected, not only by telephone, but it's connected by global trade. Mr. Speaker, we hope, certainly on this side, that reason will prevail upon this government, but we shouldn't be waiting for the problem to exist before we act. We need a policy of active engagement. Jamaica assumes the chair of CARICOM in July, and we really should be mobilizing CARICOM to speak as one voice to the regions and Jamaica's best advantage. Mr. Speaker, there's an old saying, and I'm sure you know it well, that those who plan to fail, fail to plan, and it goes the other way around. Mr. Speaker, there are two urgent issues that currently confront us. One, the impending expiry of the Cotonou Agreement in 2020 without adequate engagement of the ACP, and this is acutely discomforting because currently Jamaica is the chair of ACP. Under Jamaica's leadership, nothing is being done to protect the interests of the wider ACP community, the Caribbean region, or Jamaica's crucial political and economic interests. The other current issue, an urgent issue that's before us, Mr. Speaker, is the radical changes that are taking place in the architecture of the European Union with the impending exit of Britain from the EU, Brexit, which creates a vacuum for the ACP countries. The Cotonou Agreement, signed in 2008, provides a comprehensive framework of cooperation between us and 79 African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, including the European Union, Mr. Speaker. Its main tenets promote development, political, and importantly, economic trade cooperation. It has been adapted to new challenges of climate change, food security, regional integration, state fragility, and aid effectiveness. It is easy, Mr. Speaker, to imagine that certainly Britain and the rest of the EU is being distracted by Brexit. Not only its negotiations, but its implementation. And in this environment, it becomes increasingly difficult for countries within the ACP to be heard, especially discussions and consultations that are not ramped up immediately. And so Jamaica must act now. The negotiation cycle, Mr. Speaker, has started. And now more than ever, there is need for an adaptation of strategies and certainly aid for trade for some of our Caribbean nations and perhaps even Jamaica. Sadly, the government's doctrine of doing nothing foreign policy strategy has weakened our engagement and international respect, built through a history of distinguished leadership by not only P.J. Patterson, but Hugh Shearer, K.D. Knight, Anthony Hilton, distinguished gentlemen who have held the trade dossiers within the ACP. So let there be no doubt that our inaction in this area creates a crisis, as more than ever before, in order to grow our economy, Mr. Speaker, and protect the interests of our diaspora also, Jamaica will need not only to access new preferential trade agreements, but also continue improvements in agreements that exist, especially the Cotonou Agreement, Mr. Speaker. The very underpinnings of the global supply and value chains where goods are produced and sold through interlinked channels that involve multiple countries, enhanced production and marketing efficiency are under threat. And I heard the Minister of Tourism speak about linkages yesterday. Sir, if we don't mobilize, we're going to be under threat. These things affect our country's growth strategy directly. And that strategy demands that we find critical pathways such as a global logistics hub initiative, to play a greater role in world trade. Something that we can all agree on, Mr. Speaker, is a logistics-centered economy in Jamaica's future, and the future depends on Jamaica's stability to participate in modern trade agreements. Mr. Speaker, it is not clear to us that Jamaica's traditional stature on the world stage is being taken advantage of. We must not be left behind in the changing global environment, Mr. Speaker. We must be willing to and able to provide visionary leadership and in our Caribbean and ACP colleagues. Mr. Speaker, there is no new world coming. It's already here. And nearly half of the global GDP growth between 2010 and 2025 will come from 440 cities. Those cities are emerging markets. Most of them are small, medium-sized cities that many Western leaders have never heard about. Hsinchu in northern Taiwan is the fourth largest advanced electronics and high-tech hub in China. In 2010, Tianjin, a city that lies between 120 kilometers southeast of Beijing, had a GDP per capita of 130 billion, approximately the same size as Stockholm. By 2025, it will be raised to 625 billion. Brazil's Santa Catarina state, halfway between Sao Paulo and the Uruguayan border, is a regional hub for electronics and vehicle manufacturing, and home to a billion-dollar company such as WEG Industrious SA. Jamaica's physical location, Mr. Speaker, and our membership in a large number of international hemispheric and regional organizations, and our diaspora roots are all pillars that we can use effectively to extend our global relevance and influence on trade negotiations. An objective assessment of the Jamaican economy identifies our dependency on external sources, remittances, tourism, bauxite, the BPO sector. The price of oil is dependent on world demand. Commodity prices is dependent on world demand. We understood that in open economies like Jamaica, strategic foreign policy is inextricably linked to the service of our economic development. Mr. Speaker, the same applies today in the changing geopolitical landscape. The success of any national development policy or strategy, Mr. Speaker, will require being proactive, taking some serious risks to carve out being globally competitive, to have niche markets, and forging new relationships in international trade, while nurturing and protecting our long-standing friendships. Mr. Speaker, one of the questions that has been raised, and even by my colleague from Central Manchester yesterday, is really how will automation and technology affect our trade policies? And how are we anticipating them and protecting jobs for Jamaicans in Jamaica? The reason why he and others, and certainly myself today, are raising it is because all of us want to see economic growth. Certainly for my child, I want him to be able to live and grow up in this country. And I think all of us want that dream. I know Nathaniel wants to grow up in Jamaica and doesn't want to go away and have credit and do things in other countries. That is why we need economic growth here. Why it has been eluding us, notwithstanding the fact, Mr. Speaker, that companies are making record profits. One bank last year made $160 million on the stock exchange. Our hotels are owned by offshore companies. And so not only some of them are owned by offshore companies, many of them are booked to capacity. But what we're witnessing, and all of us have constituencies and we see it, we feel it, is that the ordinary Jamaican is still having difficulties making ends meet. All of the banks, and some of the, well, let me say not all of the banks, because maybe somebody in here might say no, and some of the insurance companies are owned by offshore companies. In the new world of free trade, Mr. Speaker, iconic national brands are owned by foreigners. Some of our iconic national brands, Jamaican brands. Jamaica is no different to this reality. Today, some of Jamaica's best-known businesses are owned by foreigners. And so while we acknowledge and we welcome and we encourage foreign direct investment, we must also ensure that these investments help to build rather than simply exploit the people of our country. We must do more to put Jamaicans at the center of our investment activities. Mr. Speaker, companies must hire Jamaicans. These companies must be tax compliant and not use their offshore services to reduce local taxes payable. They must also train Jamaicans, Mr. Speaker, for management and ensure the transfer of technology. Mr. Speaker, economic growth will continue to elude us if there's a wholesale repatriation of profits and labor services with an insignificant amount being retained right here in Jamaica. Before we provide indiscriminate incentives to foreign investors, we must properly evaluate the value added to Jamaica. Furthermore, the Ministry of Labour should really undertake a complete review of their work permit protocols to ensure that jobs that can be done by Jamaicans, qualified Jamaicans, are not issued to foreigners, especially in management, and entertainment positions within the tourism sector. Mr. Speaker, another one that we need to look at is really how we provide wholesale work permits to persons to open wholesale haberdasheries and things of that nature when Jamaicans can actually do the same thing. Mr. Speaker, sometimes the leader of the opposition exercises great patience and gives me significant leverage because of my undiplomatic approach to some things, not most things, some things. And so he has really taken a courageous chance in putting me in this portfolio. He's a courageous man. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude by saying this. The time's up for this government and their doctrine of doing nothing. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade is too silent on international issues. Public awareness and Jamaica's worldview is at an all-time low. It's time, Mr. Speaker, to focus on Jamaica's interest. Time to use our foreign affairs and foreign trade to promote domestic economic growth for Jamaicans and Jamaica now. Mr. Speaker, while I thank you, and I thank you for also putting up with me for many, many times when we've had some very heated discussions, not publicly, I want to sincerely close this discussion by paying tribute to our Jamaican teachers, not only the ones that are teaching here, but those who are teaching overseas. And from this side, to wish them a very happy day today as they continue to build our nation's future by training our children, our adults, and some of us as we go forward to try and learn and build our lives. Thank you to you all. Thank you.
Mark, I want you. Mark, I want. Wonderful. Marcus, I want to say something. I'm going to try to get Ronnie to go next. I'm going to try to get Ronnie to go next. Oh.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for suspension of standing orders to enable the Minister of Finance to hopefully conclude the Public Amendments Act, the amendments to the Public Amendments Act 2018, Act 2018. I'm quite sure that there are a number of comments that will be made by the opposition spokesman, And I hope that we can then get back to the sectoral debate. I understand that the member from Central Kingston has challenges and would like to have an opportunity to present right after, although I had indicated that he would be put in the most privileged position to be the night watchman on whom so many rely. But nonetheless, they have prevailed on us to allow him to speak after the procurement bill, and I've discussed the matter with the Minister of Justice, who has kindly consented to yield in order to give you that opportunity. So it is in that spirit then that I invite the opposition spokesman on finance to make his comments on the amendment to the Procurement Act.
The question is that standing orders be suspended to allow those in favor, those against, as Mr. Golden.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, before I get into the brief presentation I have on the bill, it is Teachers' Day today, and it was remiss of us, I think, not to have said something collectively about that. And our spokesperson on Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in her presentation raised it, and I think we should take the opportunity to acknowledge the teaching profession and our teachers for all that they do for our children and our society, often in trying circumstances. They are the nurturers for many young persons, often coming from challenged and difficult circumstances. And the profession, the teaching profession in Jamaica, has always been held in very high esteem, and we should, I think, take this opportunity on this auspicious day to celebrate our teachers and to wish them well. Mr. Speaker, the procurement legislation that we have before us is an amendment to the Public Procurement Act. And the Public Procurement Act, the Principal Act, was passed in 2015. And it was a fairly dense piece of legislation attempting to codify into statute the principles which will guide procurement in the public sector and to establish various institutional mechanisms to underpin the procurement system. And what we have before us now is an amending bill which has no doubt come into existence because of the further review of some of the issues that arise under the Principal Act and the perceived need to make some adjustments to it. The procurement system is, of course, fundamental to achieving our economic objectives because public sector investment and expenditure represents a large part of the national economy. And it is really generally recognized that the procurement process in Jamaica has been plagued with inefficiencies of one sort or another. Part of it has been in the past the opaque rule system that governs procurement, some of which was in guidelines and some of which was in circulars and whatnot. And the interplay between the Office of the Contractor General at times with the bureaucracy attempting to apply the procurement rules has led to an excessive sense of defensiveness on occasion, which has led to really protracted delays in the process of getting approvals for procurement of goods and services in the public sector. And I will recall that when we were in office, I think it was called the Infrastructure Subcommittee of Cabinet, which was chaired by the Minister for Transport, Works and Housing at the time, Dr. Omar Davis, analyzed the gaps which had elapsed between each step in the process of bringing the particular contract to the point where it could go to that committee for approval. And often there were extensive gaps of many months between one step and the next. And when you aggregate all those gaps, you would find that contracts for which funding was approved and which were to provide goods or services which were much needed were taking far too long to be approved and signed, and ultimately executed. And this has, I think, been a bugbear that successive administrations have been plagued by. And this statute that was passed in 2015 was Jamaica's attempt to introduce a modern procurement system with clear rules and with the necessary institutional underpinning to ensure fairness, but also transparency and, of course, efficiency. So we support the thrust of this legislation and any attempts to improve it. And we also hope that as it is rolled out, the training to support it will be such that we will see far more efficient execution of the procurement processes in the public sector than have been achieved in the past. Having said that, I will have a few comments on the bill itself. We have some new definitions which are being inserted into Section 2 of the bill. And one is there is an amendment to Section 2 in the definition of open bidding. And that seeks to introduce two new paragraphs, B and C, for the B and C that are in the Principal Act now. And just looking at the definition of open bidding and paragraph C, the new C would read, in accordance with Section 15, any supplier is entitled to submit a bid. And one needs to read that in the context of the Principal Act itself. So it would read, open bidding means a bidding process in which, in accordance with Section 15, any supplier is entitled to submit a bid. I just point out that Section 15.3 says that single source procurement under Section 25 of a value within the procurement method threshold is not limited to approved registered or approved unregistered suppliers. And I was asking the question, how is this treated as open bidding? If 15.3, which is referred to in the definition of open bidding, says that in 15.3 that single source procurement of a value within the procurement method threshold is not limited to approved registered or approved unregistered suppliers. The question arises, how is that to be treated as open bidding? I asked that question just so that it can be considered. In the definition of bidding documents, the new definition says bidding documents means the bidding documents developed and recommended for approval by the Office for Use in the Public Procurement Proceedings. There's some circularity in that the word that you're defining is itself used in the definition. I think that could be improved. Bid security, that definition says, means the bank guarantee or other form of security approved by the office. That language seems to suggest that the actual bank guarantee or other form of security has to be approved by the office. I would have thought that what the office would be approving would be the form of the guarantee that may be used, or the form of any other form of collateral security that may be used, rather than the actual guarantee itself. Because I don't think it's intended that each time that there's a procurement for which a bid security is required, the office, which is the entity created by the principal legislation, would have to actually approve the specific bank guarantee tender. I think the idea is to ensure that the form of bank guarantee that is used is standardized and is in a form approved by the office. The next point I wanted to make is that in the definition of domestic content, it says domestic content means goods, materials, components, services, or labor supplied from or made in Jamaica. The question I'm asking is, can they be imported by the supplier and then sold within Jamaica and still be part of domestic content? That seems counterintuitive for something that is imported to be part of domestic content. But the way in which it is worded suggests that if you supply it from within Jamaica, that would meet the definition, even if it had been originally imported by the supplier. The next point I wish to make was in the definition of domestic margin of preference. There is reference to an eligible bidder at the end of that definition, and an eligible bidder is not a defined term, and perhaps it should be. And I think that this definition doesn't have anything in it that suggests domesticity. It is purporting to say that you're purporting to define the concept of domestic margin of preference, but there's nothing in the definition itself that imports any domestic content or requirement. And I think that is that ought to be addressed for the defined term to support the actual term being defined as being a domestic margin of preference. In the definition of offsets, I noticed that there's a new definition here that replaces what was there before, and some words have been deleted. So the definition of the bill says means any condition or undertaking that encourages local growth and development, or which improves balance of payments accounts, including investment requirements, requirements for use of domestic technology, and the licensing of technology. The words that provides incentives for greater participation of disadvantaged economic actors has been deleted. And it seems to me that those words are important because those words suggest that the offsets can be designed to create a more inclusive economy where disadvantaged economic actors, whether they be MSMEs, for example, or it may be firms which employ disabled persons or what have you, that those incentives that would provide for greater participation of disadvantaged economic actors ought to be included in the definition of offsets. Yeah, yes, the idea of what is permissible by way of affirmative action for disadvantaged groups. I noticed that the new definition of set-asides says the portion of the annual procurement budget of the government of Jamaica. The idea of an annual procurement budget, I'm not sure where one would derive that annual procurement budget from. We have estimates that are approved as part of the budget exercise, which cover all forms of expenditure, capital and recurrent. But the idea of an annual procurement budget, if one wanted to identify that budget, where would one find it? I was a little perplexed by that. I move to Clause 11 of the bill. And Clause 11 is dealing with Section 23 of the Principal Act, which is being amended by deleting subsection 5 and renumbering subsections 6 and 7 as 5 and 6. But I just make the point that subsection 5 was the gateway for the application of Section 31, subsection 2, in its opening words. So, just looking at that more closely, if you, Section 23 of the Principal Act, the subsection 5 that is being deleted had said, notwithstanding anything contained in any other law to the contrary, the participation of a national bidder in international competitive bidding shall not be required to be on the same basis as that of a foreign bidder. That's the first part of it. And a national bidder shall not, as a condition for participation, be required to take any action or observe any procedure or formality that is not required of a foreign bidder. If you look at 31.2 of the Act, it's 31.2 says, except when authorized or required to do so by this Act, regulations or any other law, a procuring entity shall establish no requirement limiting the participation of persons, firms, or entities in procurement proceedings that discriminates against or among them or against or among any categories of them. Those opening words where it says, except when authorized or required to do so by this Act, these 21.3 was the gateway which allowed those opening words to apply. And by deleting 23.5, you're in effect closing that gateway. And I'm not sure why one would want to do that, because it is that gateway which is, allows 31.2 to have some import. It's the next question I have for you, Minister, is in Clause 14 of the bill, there are a whole series of new sections being inserted into the Act, and one of them is 25D. And in 25D, 1C, there are a list of things set out, 3 things. And it's not clear to me whether they're intended to be conjunctive or disjunctive. There's no conjunction there to make that clear. So I ask the question, should there be an or after Little Roman 2, or should there be an and? But without it, one isn't sure whether all of these have to be met or any of them is sufficient. The next point I wanted to make in relation to the new 25G on page 9. 25G says, a procuring entity shall not apply a less competitive method of procurement than would otherwise have been applicable to a procurement by a contrived splintering of a single procurement into separate procurements to achieve certain objectives. The question I've asked here is this an offense or not? And if it's not an offense, then what is the sanction for its breach? The use of the word contrived suggests something that has a malintent behind it, where you're contriving to splinter procurements so as to artificially reduce the estimated value and so on, and perhaps change the applicable procedure. If so, the question is, well, what is the sanction if this is not actually an offense? And perhaps it should be. In clause 20 of the bill, there's an amendment to section 51 of the Principal Act, which is deleting subsection 2. But there's no reference to 51. There's no reference to the consequential renumbering of the following sections. Section 51 has a number. The clause that's dealing with 51, which is clause 20. Clause 20. Yes, I'm just saying that there ought to be provision for the renumbering of the following sections, the subsections that follow thereafter, given that you're deleting a subsection in the middle of the section. And I would make the point that in clause 21, where there's a reference to the Section 53.2 of the Principal Act being amended by deleting the words Section 51.2 or 51.3 and substituting the words 51.3, that assumes that 51 is not renumbered. But if it is being renumbered, then that reference would be incorrect. The other point I wish to make, this whole question of what we're doing with the Integrity Commission Act and the Contractor Generals Act. And I think that you have an amendment sheet here, which I think addresses the issue I wanted to raise there. So that is much simpler as a result. Yes, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, there are also some regulations that have been tabled under the Principal Act. And those are not before us. We're not debating those today. I do have a few comments on those, which I have said to the Minister I will do my best to provide him with comments on before the next sitting of the House. Because when we debate regulations, we don't make amendments to them. So if they're worthy of taking on board some adjustments, that will enable the Minister to do so and to table the regulations with those adjustments made if he sees fit. So, Mr. Speaker, those are the comments that I have to make. So they're fairly detailed comments, but having gone through the bill fairly carefully, there are some other comments which are more of a grammatical or typographical nature. I wouldn't bother to raise those at this stage. When we get to committee, I would take those points at that stage if we're going to deal with whether we do the committee stage today or the Minister wants to have a chance to look through some of the comments I've made and complete this process on another occasion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to ask that the debate be suspended until further notice, until the next sitting of the House.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. House Leader.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, we will now have the presentation by the member from Central Kingston, as mentioned earlier, and it will be followed by the Minister of Justice.
Reverend Tweets.
He is following the proceedings from elsewhere.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I think I should express great thanks to the rump of members who have agreed to attend this presentation. And I would like to begin by adding my grateful consideration to the teachers of Jamaica, all 28,000 of them, and the significant more others who teach in the early childhood sector who are not usually counted among the teaching profession, but who play such a vital role as both government and opposition acknowledge. Mr. Speaker, I wrote this presentation in the wake of that unfortunate session of Parliament that we had 2 weeks ago, and I would wish to spend a couple of minutes just reflecting on the way we do business in this Parliament and what public perception is of it. The creolization of the so-called Westminster model, which we have adapted, often degenerates into going at each other's guts with incivility and brashness in an attempt to gain power or to retain power. And Mr. Speaker, this way isn't working for those who sent us here. Half of our voters have written us off as diversionary and corrupt. Many of the remainder are mostly looking something from us in a society which is laced with unfairness, scarcity, and greed. Mr. Speaker, they may big us up on Palm Sunday, but they will as easily crucify us the following Friday. Thank God for a political culture that allows divergent opinions. We must always celebrate that. But don't we see the disappointed and confused faces of the schoolers when they're leaving the gallery after hearing us, members of the highest court of the land, hearing us traduce and disrespect each other, calling each other fool and hypocrite and thief, tearing down everything the other side has sincerely tried or is trying to do. Symbols can be important. Our titles and our trappings are temporary and often burdensome. They're given to us to facilitate service and effort, not for self-promotion and hubris. You know of my suggestion that we should reconfigure this hall. Let us sit not according to party affiliation, but alphabetically or by parish of representation. This would be one small but significant way that we come to perceive ourselves and have others perceive us not as warring tribes, seeking ways to reap advantage, but as collaborators in the sacred, yes, Mr. Speaker, I use that word several times, sacred and difficult task of governance. Let us stop being the victims of our own sabotage. Inspired leadership requires mutual trust and civility, not public relations and fake smiles as we screw each other in public view or by backroom arrangement. Adversarial politics was intended as a foil against the autocracy of the king, the church, and other unyielding tyranny. What we are in danger of doing is, by exaggerating our differences, we lapse into a chronic state of mistrust and bickering, itself tyrannical because it places party advantage above national interest. Carl Stoll warned us about this a generation ago in his book, Politics versus Economics. I don't think we've learned the lesson he would have taught us well yet. The current order of political economy cannot take us where we want to go. That is why more than half of our people would migrate if they had the chance, why so many think they would be better off if we were still a colony. Please, please, colleagues, do not let us continue to be the last to appreciate the paralyzing death of alienation abroad in this land. For the truth that most of the population already know, but we seem not to, is that neither side alone can lead Jamaica out of the morass of social deconstruction, economic malaise, and widening inequality which cramps the life prospects of our people. Look what the wholehearted agreement on electoral policy and fidelity to economic stabilization has wrought for us already. Why should this approach be the exception and not the norm in developing and executing national policy? I'm calling then for a rethinking of parliamentary conduct as an outward sign of our commitment to a deeper reformation of those aspects of our political culture which thrive on one-upmanship, divisiveness, and corruption instead of collaboration towards common purpose. In this spirit, and in relation to the state of education and training, I first wish to express appreciation for the response that I have received from the Ministry of Education whenever I have requested information, and to express respect for what the present administration is trying to achieve in this most vital area of development. For should we fail, it would scuttle all hopes for happiness and growth. There will be no 5 and 4, no achievement of 2030 goals, no movement towards equality and fairness in the society, unless we become a people known to the world and confident in ourselves as being competent in academic and technical skills and well-adjusted and moral in our social life. Mr. Speaker, the children of Jamaica can't wait on a change of administration to see improvement in education and training. So with a commitment to constructive criticism, and because tribalism in education is a boomerang, the following proposals and comments are offered. Basic outcomes. First, Jamaica needs a clear easily understandable vision of what educational outcomes we buy into for all of our people. We therefore propose some targets, preferably in 5, but in no more than 7 years from now. Every adult Jamaican must be able to be assessed as able to read, write, and speak standard Jamaican English. They must have at least a grade 11 competency in practical mathematics and information technology, a level 2 certification in at least one occupational area, and a measurably satisfactory suite of social skills, civic awareness, and the inculcation of personal responsibility. Mr. Speaker, this is the bare minimum to ground 21st century competitiveness. This is the only antidote. This is the only antidote to the diarrhea of $20 billion or more that we double spend on remedial education every year, not to mention the chronic loss of productivity and the decline of social capital. These are the targets, the ideals around the achievement of which we all must collaborate. And we commit on this side the political tendency that we represent to this great purpose. I turn now to early childhood education. I thank the member from the part of St. Elizabeth for his remarks yesterday. I wish to say that the certification of early childhood institutions, though helpful, is insufficient to bring about the revolution of care and healthy socialization required for babies and young children. The deficiencies of family and community structure require a complete reorientation of approach. The acquisition of basic social skills and the embedding of appropriate behavior habits must now become as high a priority as the development of language and measurement competencies. Mr. Speaker, this morning I met 2 members of young ladies, members of Central Kingston constituency, and they are 17, one 18, and they have had, in one case, 2 children, the other 1. And I asked where were the fathers of these children, because they all wanted money to buy Lasco or to take the child to the clinic. And their reply was, the father, they were him supposed to be. And I inquired further, and both of them were completely unaware that a father's presence is really needed, along with the mother, checking for the child to ensure the proper upbringing of that child. They have never had that experience in their life. And I'm sure that every one of us here has the same experience in our own constituencies. The values of honesty, truthfulness, respect for life, respect for law, discipline and productivity, faithfulness and compassion, commitment have to be infused from the very earliest level into our young children, most of whom do not have the opportunity of a mother and a father working together, hopefully living together, to see to their upbringing. This has to be intentional and it has to be exaggerated. The problem with our national objectives now is not one of CSEC subjects or of NCTVET achievements. It is the fact of social deficiencies which are robbing the benefit of the capital that the government, that parents, that philanthropists offer to the education system. If you improve family life, Mr. Speaker, you improve education. And this is not happening yet, and cannot happen without the introduction of qualified and properly paid teachers supported by volunteer mentors from churches and community organizations. I recognize the efforts of the government, but it is still true that almost 80% of all the teachers in our early childhood institutions are untrained or unsuitably trained. Reassigning surplus teachers to this sector doesn't work well. The little ones require the best teachers the nation has to offer. This is new. That is why we on this side commit to support funding for a 3-year program starting now to train and deploy 5,000 specially selected teachers in the early childhood institutions. The leader of the opposition had mooted the idea when he spoke. And Mr. Speaker, I gather that the Chase Fund, long the supporting institution, the main supporting institution of early childhood education, has now been instructed that they must only support infant schools. That is not a good idea. We are creating rather than solving a problem, and I appeal to the government to reverse that backward decision. The training and deployment of these teachers would cost several billion a year. My estimate is about $8 billion a year. But it is a worthwhile contribution to national security, as well as educational efficiency. This is meaningful social intervention, and this is what this side commits to. Mr. Speaker, I turn now to nutrition. Given increasing poverty and rising prices, an estimated 40% of our school children come to school hungry. And if they are to learn, require breakfast or lunch, or more realistically, both. The government has offered commendable increases in subventions for school feeding, but these are being overcome by added need. Let us be truthful and realistic. And it is the school teacher who knows each child's need and capacity, not the path officer. We commit, and ask all of us to commit, to providing whatever nutrition each student needs and which his or her family cannot afford. This is not happening yet. $150 a day is uncertain in most instances, yes, and it is insufficient. Without adequate and preferably locally grown food, all learning is compromised. I wish I could persuade the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Finance the remarkable prospects, and the Minister of Tourism who spoke yesterday so well, the remarkable prospects for linkage that arise in the school feeding program. Probably spend $6 to $8 billion a year between the state and families to feed children in school. And yet 97% of the food that we feed them is imported food. Poor nutrition, wasteful of foreign exchange when our farmers languish without market and stimulus for their own activity. This is a project that we need to take on in order to revive the agricultural sector, because the best product perhaps would go to the tourism sector, and I don't want to say the what left would make it possible. Why can't we give our children banana a day? Why can't we use our yams, as Dr. Henry Lowe has proved to be done so efficiently, to make a porridge? Why can't we give them some chicken rather than the greasy stuff and the large quantities of carbohydrates that presently exist? What about the fruit? Instead of importing concentrate from the Far East, what about the employment, the social uplift that could come from stimulating our own agriculture? I beseech you, this is not a matter of controversy. It should be a matter of common initiative. With regards to primary education, Mr. Speaker, the nation must move away from the system of promotion by age rather than by performance. We now have the space in most of our primary schools to do this. There is nothing more futile and counterproductive than advancing students to higher grades before they have mastered foundational learning. It may take 1 year longer for some students to achieve the required standards. Some 20% of our students at the last survey were indicated to fall somewhere on the spectrum of exceptionalities, usually challenges rather than giftedness. It is pointless to have these children go for year after year after year up the scheme on the conveyor belt when the prospects of success are so limited. What could be more suffocating of the efforts of teachers on this Teachers' Day? To have children coming to a grade 7 from a primary school to undertake secondary education, and they can't read, they can't write. What is more embarrassing do we find when even graduates of our university are unable, after their degree is granted, to speak proper English and to conduct themselves in the language of commerce and of law. As far as secondary education is concerned, in this brief survey, if the suggested measures for primary education are implemented starting now, the academic standard and deportment of young people entering high school will have considerably improved, and this will allow for the better allocation of secondary places and the timely contraction of the differences between the traditional and non-traditional schools. In the meanwhile, schools should cluster on the basis of proximity, religious affiliation, or other social similarity in order to share resources, improve image, and do social planning. The schools which score best on the EduFocus scale, and all of them are church or trust sponsored, should be incentivized to extend their brand to other schools for the common good. Some years ago, Mr. Speaker, I tried to ensure that a new school being set up in Mandeville carried the brand, the assistance, not token, but actual assistance from Campion College, one of the highest reputed schools. Yes? If there are 45 relatively highly regarded so-called traditional high schools, what if they were encouraged to, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, enlarge their tents and deal with, relate to, share staff, laboratory facilities, and other things with a school which is not as highly equipped or regarded? It wouldn't demean them, rather it would extend their reach, and it would not be a total solution, but an important assistance to the bifurcation that exists between some schools and the others. And may I respectfully suggest that offering the same amount to secondary schools, irrespective of their status, is not equitable. There must be differential support for those who are most in need, especially in the STEAM subjects, which are so important. Mr. Speaker, I turn to absentees and dropouts. 1 in every 5 students is absent from school each day. In some areas, 3% of the boys and some girls drop out before grade 11. There is presently no universal or effective means of tracking them, and many end up in criminal situations or become victims of human trafficking. The ministry must at once declare the whole island a truancy zone, improve public education as to the necessity for regular presence, and assign social workers with resources to trace absentees with a target to improve attendance to above 90% by the end of the 2019 school year. It is the children from weak families and the poorest economic circumstances who are most likely to miss school and often to drop out. 50% of all students are on path. Another 20% need to be. I'm sure that all of us know that. The present allocations, acknowledging the recent improvement, are simply not enough to cover from Monday to Friday, especially if long distances have to be traveled. School personnel are closest to students and best know their needs. Government should consider giving principals resources to meet emergency needs to augment the support which every school should receive from the community of care, which we propose each school should nurture. Mr. Speaker, like all of members of Parliament, I'm sure we're being approached by parents now who are registering their children for new schools. And every single one that comes has a voucher. Every single one, and the vouchers are greater than last year and the year before. And so, please, let us be realistic about what we can finance and what we must encourage others to assist with. The International Monetary Fund, in its most recent assessment, encourages savings in other areas of state expenditure for more investment in education, especially at the early childhood level. We should follow their advice. This year's flat budget for education is not encouraging. There is evidence that up to 40% of already scarce teaching and learning time in Jamaican schools is wasted on administrative and disciplinary issues. Beyond this, learning is often compromised by a minority of disruptive students whose correction is beyond the effort of a class teacher. The present disciplinary code does not match the behavioral dysfunction of such students. Detentions are a joke, suspension is an unearned vacation, and expulsion a last resort with huge negative consequences for all. I was pleased to hear yesterday from the Minister of State that there is plans for this, but they need to be developed urgently, while acknowledging the great effort and partial efficacy of this school-wide behavior management system, Dream a World, Change from Within. We suggest that the Institute of Excellence, about which Dr. Phillips spoke, and which can grow out of the excellent National College of Educational Leadership developed by Dr. Maurice Smith and others, be tasked to engage the best behavioral scientists and international best practices to develop by next year, we must have targets. If you can't measure, you can't in any way hold accountable. A modern disciplinary code for Jamaican schools, fully suited to our social realities. So much hangs on education and training for personal and national progress. And so much hangs on the role and function of the Jamaican teacher. There has to be an intentional process to attract and retain the best and brightest of our school leavers to become teachers. We are losing them fast. Mr. Speaker, we're making a mistake to classify them, the teachers, among other public sector workers. We must screen those who wish to enter the profession very carefully, as we have not done in the past, for suitable character traits. If the people of Jamaica are paying in part or whole for your teacher education, then there must be effective bonding and market-related incentives, especially for good male teachers, mathematics and science teachers, and other skilled personnel. Mr. Speaker, when I was a university student abroad in the 1960s, I couldn't leave after a vacation without providing an income tax clearance. Why is it that those who benefit from student loans or from other benefices from the state are not similarly bound, so that we do not have these vast arrears which then cripple and bring into disrepute the very system of assistance? Mr. Speaker, the tenuring of teachers to specific institutions and the overly complex procedures for their discipline and accountability continue to prevent the nimbleness of Jamaican education to respond to demographic changes and the imperative of high-quality differentiated learning opportunities. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, that a teacher, after acting in a vacant post for 1 year, is tenured in that post to that institution for life, you know? Could you run a ministry and institution, your business, Mr. Speaker, like that? The proposed Jamaica Teaching Council bill tries to address these issues, but does not go far enough. This side commits to share in a sensitive but unpostponable discourse and negotiation, which we suggest the ministry must begin without delay to review all the terms and conditions of employment of school personnel, designed to offer them greater reward and efficiency, and to best align human resources to the goals of equitable and quality education for all. We last did this in 1980. The world, national needs, and personal aspirations have all changed since then. We have to be brave enough to break some of the old molds in education and training. The reality is that a considerable proportion of our children are strangers to Jamaican Standard English when they come to school. Contrary to historic assumptions, Jamaican Standard English is not spoken or read to them at home, nor on the streets, nor increasingly on social and even mainline media. Jamaican Creole is a language they most know, albeit often with limited vocabulary. How, Mr. Speaker, can children learn well when they may not understand what the teacher is saying or what is in the book? Just as social deficiencies constitute the greatest cramp to school effectiveness, so the language barrier is a huge impediment to learning. Competence in Jamaican Standard English is non-negotiable, but I am now convinced, as I was not before, that it has to be taught as a second language. The shift system in all schools has served its purpose and must now be abolished forthwith. I agree with you, Minister. The previous administration was on track to have completed that task this year and regret that it has been delayed. Why, we ask? Adjusting priorities in education and training ought to be undertaken by consensus, not by ministerial fiat. Tertiary education and training constitute the biggest capital gains which any person can add to their life and to the nation's well-being. Savings used for this purpose yields lifelong dividends. Yet of the $800+ billion of people's money in the financial sector, only a small fraction, less than 1%, is available to finance post-secondary education. This makes no sense. that you can buy a car, that you can spend on some other consumable, but not get financing for post-secondary education. It is time that an insistent effort be led by us, the political directorate, to negotiate long-term, low-interest, minimal or no collateral facilities with banks and pension funds, so that by 2028, the latest, 60% of those leaving high schools can be aided towards higher qualifications, and at least 50% of the workforce can be certified in some useful field of endeavor. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to end on the same note I began. The task of a responsible opposition in the area of education and training is not to beat down the sincere efforts of an administration, but to offer collaboration and constructive criticism. The children of Jamaica, brimming with ambition and capacity, don't really check for which party is in power. The national cause needs greater equity and quality in education and training now, not later. We recognize how difficult it is to keep a large and often disjointed system going from day to day, while at the same time trying to effect radical change. In short, any administration needs help, especially if you think you have all the answers. Education, after all, is everyone's business. Success requires an intense and respectful cooperation between political forces, state agencies, parents, teachers, alumni, church, and the private sector. Each has an indispensable role to play in crafting the community of care around each student and school. In this sacred cause, each of us, particularly those of us in high office, is called to be the compassionate Jesus, not the arrogant and strident Caesar. Thank you.
Minister Chuck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For members who are not aware, I am about to close the child diversion bill. I'd like to begin by thanking those members who made contributions to the bill, in particular my friends Floyd Green, Mark Golden, Horace Daly, Ms. Angela Brown-Burke, and Alonda Terrelong and Ms. Lisa Hanna, who made contributions to the bill. One of the main points noted, Mr. Speaker, is about the training of the judges and the police to ensure that the bill is brought into proper implementation, and I will shortly use a few minutes to indicate how the training will proceed. But, Mr. Speaker, the member from Mark is southeast, southwest, Mark, South St. Andrew, made very important contributions in the debate to a number of sections of the bill. And before looking at the monitor, where I will just indicate in a few minutes, very shortly, how the training will proceed for the police and the courts, I just want to indicate that the contribution from the member from South St. Andrew was quite useful, and his comments were taken into consideration, and a number of the changes that he suggested have been taken into consideration, and they have been put in the amendments, and the amendments have been circulated. So I would like to thank the member from South St. Andrew who made some useful contribution. In particular, Mr. Speaker, in Section 8 of the bill, he asked for the children's advocate to be included, and we will include the children's advocate when we amend the Section 8 of the bill. He did indicate that we should include the senior family court judge but it would be inappropriate to include a judge who eventually will have to, if the necessary outcomes don't take place, have to adjudicate. So we are not going to include the parish court judge in that suggestion. In section 14, Mr. Speaker, he advised that a number of very useful indication that why should the court approve going to the child diversion in that particular instance, and we accepted his comment, and so we are going to remove subsections 2 and 3 based on his comments. In subsection 19, he indicated the language was not appropriate, and we have changed the language of subsection 19, subsection 8. Then, Mr. Speaker, in subsection 21, he asked the question, why should the victim be consulted if we are going to send an offender to child diversion? In truth, diversion is somewhat related to restorative justice. So to the extent that the victim should be consulted and should know that if the victim is an assault that has been occasioned, at least the victim should know that the offender is going to be warned and put in a child diversion activity so that the victim recognizes that the child has not been brought to the court but has been put to a child diversion activity. In truth, if the victim's consent is not obtained unreasonably because the victim is withholding the consent, then we would certainly go to court to ask for the court to provide the consent so that the child diversion activity can be engaged. Mr. Speaker, a number of suggestions made by the member we have acknowledged and incorporated, and in truth, when we get to committee stage, we will see how many of his comments have been utilized in ensuring that the bill is a better bill. So I want to thank the member from South St. Andrew who made very useful comments, and we have incorporated them. And at committee stage, we will see how these comments have been incorporated. Mr. Speaker, if we look at the screen, we will see the training that will be incorporated in child diversion, so that not only will the police be trained to use child diversion, but the court system and the judges in the courts will also be trained so that they know at what stage they can use child diversion to assist our young people. So, Mr. Speaker, if we look at the very top, we will see that the police play an integral role, and at the very beginning, the police can decide, first, if it's a minor offense, to warn the child and release the child, and this is really an informal warning. But where, Mr. Speaker, it is a more serious offense, or the child is very unruly and won't accept the advice, then this formal warning is executed, and the parents of the child will also be immediately brought in, interviewed, to ensure that the parents participate in really assisting the child to go straight, because the child and the parents will be told what offense has been committed and why we're utilizing the warning to avoid taking the child to court. So if the warning is adhered to and the child accepts that everything is okay and really go straight, then there's no need to go further. But it will also be sent to the Child Diversion Committee, and the Child Diversion Committee would watch the behavior of the child, and over a period of time, if the conditions of the warning is adhered to, then that's the end of the case. But if the child continues to misbehave, then the matter may well have to go to the court. So to the extent that if the child completes the child diversion program, the case is closed. But if the child does not complete the child diversion activity, he may be charged and brought to court. So if he's brought to court, the court now has to make a decision based on further warnings, further instructions to the child to behave, continue with the program, and if that child diversion activity is properly adhered to by the child, then the matter can be completed. But if the child fails to complete the program, then the child will in fact be charged, and a trial will take place. And if the child is convicted before sentence, the child will give another opportunity. You have been convicted, we're going to give you the opportunity to go straight, but if you fail to go straight, you come back for sentencing. So once the child has been charged and convicted, if the continuing child diversion program is properly carried out, then the sentence will not be imposed. The child will be released. But if the child fails to complete the program, then he will be brought back to court and may be sentenced, which could be an incarceration. So if the child is incarcerated, then the post-trial, which is another concern, at that stage the child